Secret Hitler, a novel by Secret Himmler, Part 2, Interlude. Barbara went out for a walk. The last few weeks had been stressful. She hadn't really felt like herself, even at work and around family and friends where she could wear more colorful makeup and stylish clothes that showed off some of her tattoos. Something about having normal colored hair and not having her piercings in made her feel more repressed. The cool breeze and fresh air weren't helping as much as she'd hoped, but the little bit of risk in taking a walk alone made her feel adventurous, and at least that was a kind of release for her. She didn't smoke often, but she'd bought a pack of cigarettes to deal with the stress. She understood why some people smoked so much, as the nicotine only relieved her stress for a little while and then left her craving more. As she took the last drag of her cigarette and then crushed the butt beneath her tennis shoe, she wondered why the last 2 weeks had been so hard on her. Sure, waking up early on Sundays to spend a couple hours listening to hate speech sucked, but it felt like there was something more. Having to suppress herself was part of it. She had a wild spirit, and the church definitely made her feel chained down by the modest dresses and plain looks she had to wear to fit in. But it was something more than that, too. She checked her phone and saw that the two moms in the church ladies' chat were sharing silly pictures of their kids. She gave them heart reacts even though her heart wasn't in it. She had never wanted kids and didn't want to think about the time she'd almost had one, but seeing the happy mothers in church brought those feelings up again. She felt like she was being forced to deal with a part of herself that she'd buried and didn't want to look at. As she looked up again, she saw a fenced-in playground behind a daycare center, and that made the pain even worse. The sign on the side of the building said Carefree Playpen and had little pink hearts and blue triangles on it. She tried to ignore it and walk on past when suddenly a little girl ran up to the fence and stared at her with a silly smile on her face. Barbara stopped and stared at the child, stunned by what she saw. The kid looked just like the picture she had of herself as a child. She looked to be about 5 years old, with short brown hair that was a little bit messy from playing outside all afternoon. All the memories of the abortion she'd had almost 6 years ago came flooding back as she stared at the little girl who looked just like what she imagined her daughter would have looked like if she were alive. Barbara tried to force a smile back, but it felt like part of her heart wanted to rip out of her chest and give itself to the little girl. As she stared, trying to smile and stop herself from crying, a middle-aged woman who looked to Barbara almost like a predatory bird came over and put her hand on the child's shoulder, trying to shoo her away from the fence. The woman glared at Barbara, and she couldn't help but feel like she was watching a villain in a movie snatching her daughter away from her. The woman looked directly at Barbara, and somehow, despite the distance between them, Barbara thought she clearly heard her say, "Come along, child, do as you're told." It was like a predatory bird was staring her down, trying to intimidate her. For a moment she was paralyzed by fear, but she shook it off as the woman turned away to push the child along. She knew the feeling was crazy and turned around to trudge back to her apartment, but some part of her had to take one last look at the little girl as she was being led away. The girl was reaching one arm out towards her, grasping at the empty air, and making a face like she was being torn away from her mother by a monster. The goofy smile was gone, replaced by fear and pain. Barbara jogged for a block, despite how the cigarette she'd just smoked made her lungs burn as she had to breathe heavier. She wanted to get away from the terrifying woman, from the tricks her mind was playing on her. There was no way she could have heard what that woman was saying so clearly from so far away, and yet she had. She knew she was being irrational. There's no way that was her child. The feelings coming to her were there because she'd been obsessively thinking about her abortion now that she was forced to hang out with people who had kids and seemingly happy family lives. The guilt of her own life choices, of a life of casual sex parties with men who made her feel used rather than satisfied, the brief lesbian flings she'd had after giving up her unborn baby in an attempt to wash away the memories of getting used by men, the years since when she'd been on and off birth control, and the agonizing irony of finding herself much less attracted to men when she was on birth control and could actually sleep with them. It was all coming back to haunt her, and the woman was probably just old and not a witch. Besides, witches were friendly, like Kenzie, right? Why was life this way? Why did she feel so miserable? She was living her best life, wasn't she? She was free to be herself, so why did it feel like part of herself was missing? Why did the moms seem so happy? They were chained down to husbands and babies, but they didn't seem to feel used the way she felt after so many of the men she'd slept with. They must be faking it. They were putting on a face, pretending to be happy to hide their own misery. She knew it. Their lives were so boring that they posted about the silly things their kids were doing as if it was the most interesting thing in the world. So why did that little girl's silly face make her feel like an important part of her life had been ripped away from her almost 6 years ago? She hadn't been trying to get pregnant. She didn't even realize she was pregnant until months later. The missed periods should have been a clue, but that was an unpleasant part of being a woman that she'd always tried to pay as little attention to as she could get away with. By the time she started gaining weight and started to admit to herself that she was pregnant, she was already a few months along, and didn't want to think about it or let it affect her lifestyle. She couldn't really afford to see a doctor at the time anyway, and it was only when she realized how much more expensive a baby would be that she asked a few of her friends what to do about it. One of them had recommended Dr. Rubin, a very friendly woman who told her that she could have the abortion for free as long as she signed a waiver allowing the fetus to be sold for medical use. At the time, she'd felt like Dr. Rubin saved her life, but as she thought about her now, her mind warped the image of her into a bird of prey, just like the woman at the daycare. She shook her head and tried to focus on her surroundings as she continued her walk home, but she couldn't keep the thoughts from coming back and haunting her. What had she done? Why had she thrown away her baby? Why had she let that predatory monster steal her baby from her? Why had she let herself get pregnant? Why had some man, she wasn't even sure which man, used her body and left her to deal with the consequences? Pushing the thoughts away wasn't working. Trying to push the blame onto Dr. Rubin and whichever of the men had taken advantage of her was working somewhat better. She tried to remember who she'd slept with. There were quite a few guys within the month or so when it could have happened, including at least one party where she'd gotten drunk enough that she couldn't remember what happened. Weren't Charles, Ronald, and Paul at that party? Seeing them again had probably triggered the memories just as much as seeing the kids at the church, building up to her hysterical reaction at the daycare. She finally got back to her apartment, went upstairs, and locked herself inside. It felt like a prison. She didn't want to go outside and face the world, but being locked up inside with her own thoughts wasn't helping any. She took out a bottle of wine, poured a glass, and drained it much too quickly. She knew drinking the pain away wouldn't help, but she had to do something to deal with it. And she would have to endure a girls' night with the moms in a few days. She poured another glass of wine and left the bottle on the counter as she walked back to her room, finished the glass, closed the curtains, and turned off the light, only to lay in bed crying until the alcohol put her to sleep. Chapter 13. Sandra was surprised that the group had accepted her suggestion of going to an art museum. It was much better than sitting at someone's house, and the only person who wanted to go to a bar or club was Barbara. Sandra didn't think that idea was any better than just meeting at someone's house. Even if she didn't get any good leads on the case, it at least gave her an excuse to leave work early on a Friday and go somewhere interesting. Sandra got there a little early and waited outside. Her car had a couple of built-in cameras, and even though she had already caught the plates of everyone at the church and looked up their identities from there, she still attempted to park where her car cameras could catch people entering and leaving the lot. Sandra waited in the museum lobby. After a few minutes, Mary and Wendy walked in together. She'd never actually met Wendy, but Mary had told them she was going to bring a friend. Wendy was petite, wearing an emerald green dress that contrasted her pale blue eyes and straight sandy blonde hair. Sandra sensed a quiet intensity behind those eyes that made her curious as they gently shook hands. Natalie walked in not long after. Sandra had only met Natalie a couple of times, but she seemed like a sweet woman. They exchanged friendly greetings and hugs, and Sandra managed to endure a few minutes of small talk with them before Carol and Barbara arrived. Carol looked like her usual calm and collected self, while Barbara had a troubled look in her puffy eyes that all the makeup in the world couldn't hide. After another round of greetings and hugs, Mary said, "The moms texted me and said they'd be a little late. We can get started without them and they can catch up with us when they get here." "Oh, okay," Carol replied. "This is so cool. I haven't been to a museum in ages." "Yeah, really great idea, Sandra," Natalie added. "We get to enjoy some nice white culture." "Hopefully," Mary added. "I think they focus more on classic art here," Wendy said. "There shouldn't be too much modern art or DIY art." "Good," Mary replied. They each paid the entry fee and walked into the first hall in the museum where a number of classical American paintings were on display, mostly of wilderness and rural landscapes. Sandra had been a city girl all her life, and the closest she'd gotten to real wilderness was city parks, flying overhead, and occasionally driving down backcountry roads when her GPS led her down strange shortcuts on long drives. She appreciated the beauty of the scenery and the talent it took to create the paintings, but they were the kind of scenes she preferred to appreciate in a very detached sort of way. Mary, Natalie, Wendy, and Carol all seemed to be appreciating the beauty of the paintings. Barbara seemed to be bothered by something, and Sandra got the impression she was simply staring in the direction of the paintings without really looking at them. "Wouldn't it be wonderful to live somewhere like this?" Natalie was gazing at a painting of a stream running through a forest, with vivid green leaves, purple and yellow flowers, colorful fruits hanging from some of the trees, and light, fluffy clouds in the sky half covered by the trees. It was certainly a pretty picture, but Sandra thought living there would be rather boring. "It's gorgeous," Mary replied. "Total return to the land material right there." "Oh yeah," Wendy confirmed. "Imagine going out there to pick fruit with your kids. That'd be so much fun." "One of Bruce's friends has a homestead like that," Natalie said. "We've taken our kids out there to pick berries in the spring and apples in the fall. They just love it. And it's so peaceful out there, away from all the noise of the city. Aside from the occasional coyote, but that's just an excuse for the dad or his boys to get some target practice." Sandra was used to guns since she carried a small .380 concealed handgun, but she had never had to fire it at another living being and hoped she never would. "That sounds wonderful," Wendy replied. "Me and Robert have been talking about return to the land, maybe moving to one of their compounds once we get married. Hopefully we can find one this pretty to move to." Carol asked, "What's return to the land?" "Oh, it's this white-only homesteading group," Mary explained. "They've bought a few patches of rural land and are building their own communities out there, trying to become as self-sufficient as possible so they're not dependent on the Jews and all the companies they own." Carol simply stared at her with a confused look on her face, and Sandra wasn't entirely sure what she meant either. "You know, growing gardens, raising chickens and stuff," Wendy continued. "Building their own homes so that way if they try another COVID where if you don't accept their bullshit you get fired or can't go shopping or whatever, they can still feed themselves and don't end up homeless." "That sounds wonderful," Natalie said, "but it'd be a lot of work. I'd love to visit a place like that, but I don't know if I could handle the work of living there. Off-grid living isn't easy at all." "It's not so much that it's what we want to do," Wendy said. "It's more that we think we might have to." Carol asked, "So is it some kind of commune?" "Minus the communism," Mary answered, and Carol smiled slightly, seemingly understanding. Sandra thought about what it might mean for a bunch of people in the far right to be living in off-grid communities. Would they be able to avoid government tracking by having a bunch of people living on some rural property, far from the cameras and GPS devices used by people in the cities? Could they be preparing some kind of Unabomber-style terrorism? Perhaps Secret Hitler was hiding out on one of their compounds. "Do they have any compounds near here?" Sandra asked. "Not yet," Mary replied. "Not as far as I know." So much for that idea, but the billboard hacking and camera glitches didn't fit the profile of a bunch of low-tech, off-grid hippie Nazis running to the woods to get away from technology, so Sandra decided it was an unlikely possibility. They made their way through the room, occasionally commenting on which paintings they liked or disliked and why, before moving on to the next room. The paintings in this room were all of people, with many of them focused on families and children. "Gosh, this one looks so wholesome," Natalie said, looking at a painting of a mother playing with her children. "Who knew there were still such wholesome places left?" Mary said, admiring it with her. Sandra had never gotten far enough in a relationship to get to the point of thinking about having children. It's not that she disliked dating, but she was a very private person, which made it hard for people to get to know her, especially since she had a tendency to test people before letting them get too close. When she did find someone she liked, she had a tendency to become too intensely emotional and scare them away. Seeing the paintings of happy families and mothers with their children gave her a bit of a sense of longing for what could have been, and still maybe could be, but probably wouldn't happen for her, but the feeling was nothing she couldn't handle. Barbara, however, seemed to be having a much more difficult time handling it. She was staring at a painting of a young brunette mother that looked somewhat like her leading a young girl by the hand, and she looked like she was about to cry. Sandra was the first to notice, but Mary soon noticed it too and put a hand on her back, gently rubbing her. "Are you okay?" Barbara's face twisted up in grief, and she quickly covered her face with her hands, trying in vain not to let anyone see her cry. Carol rushed over and gave her a hug, pulling Barbara's face to her shoulder and trying to comfort her. Barbara sobbed for a moment before regaining her composure and wiping her eyes with her hand. Natalie pulled a tissue out of her purse and offered it to her so she could dry her eyes and keep her makeup from running. "I'm sorry," Barbara said, her voice cracking a bit. Carol asked, "What's wrong?"
It's...
She trailed off as she looked at the other women in the group as if she was carefully considering how much to say.
It's okay, we're here for you,
Mary said in a comforting voice. Barbara looked away from her and breathed deeply a few times. Sandra could tell something was deeply bothering her, but didn't know her well enough to have any idea what it was, and Carol seemed confused too, so she assumed it was something she hadn't even talked to her closest friend in the group about yet. Barbara looked back at the group and looked like she was about to start talking a couple times before finally figuring out what to say.
A few years ago, I had a miscarriage. It was before I found Jesus, and, well, I wasn't actually sure who the dad was, so at the time, part of me was actually happy about it.
She looked very guilty, but Sandra had a feeling the guilt was an act, even though the pain from the memory was real.
I thought I had dealt with those feelings, but a couple days ago I was out for a walk, and I saw a little girl at this daycare a few blocks from my place that looked just like me when I was a kid. She was about the same age my daughter would have been if...
Barbara sniffled and raised the tissue up to her eyes, covering her face with her hands again as she let out another sob, and both Carol and Mary moved to comfort her.
It's not your fault,
Carol told her, hugging her again as Mary rubbed her back.
Maybe God showed you what you needed to see for a reason, Wendy suggested. Now that you've found Jesus, you can work through the pain of your past and move forward to something better. You still have plenty of time to find a good Christian man and start a family. Maybe God is trying to give you the sign that it's time to forgive yourself and learn from your past so you can move forward. I know some of the guys in the movement make a big deal about virginity and chastity and all that, but they aren't perfect either. Robert was with an ex of his before we got together, but thankfully they didn't have any kids, and he's not rushing me. So just focus on asking Jesus to forgive you, and once you've repented, move forward and do better.
Sandra was surprised by how good Wendy's advice was, despite how rooted it was in religion. A part of her even wondered if she should take that advice herself regarding her own difficulty finding a man she could trust, though she didn't think she would. What surprised her more, though, was the brief look of revulsion on Barbara's face, as if the idea of God giving her a sign bothered her. It wasn't what she expected from someone who had converted to Christianity, especially since recent converts tended to be the most zealous believers. There was a long pause before Barbara replied,
I don't know,
She was interrupted by the two young mothers walking into the room.
Hey, nice to see you!
One of them offered Sandra a hug while the other offered Natalie one. Then they made their way through the group giving hugs and friendly greetings. When one of them got to Barbara, she asked,
Is everything all right?
Yeah, Barbara replied. Nice to see you, and offered her a hug. When the greetings were done, Barbara stuffed the tissue in her pocket.
Sorry, I'm fine now. Thanks for the support.
Yeah, Mary replied.
If you ever need to talk about it, we're here for you.
We've got to support our own, Natalie added, since no one else will. One of the moms asked, Did we miss something?
She's just dealing with something, Wendy told her. It's fine, though. We're all good. The museum is wonderful. Did you get a chance to look around the first room? So many pretty paintings.
The other mom replied,
We just came straight through since we saw you all in here. This room is even better, Wendy continued. So many wholesome family scenes. You're gonna love it. Coming here was a really great idea.
Yeah, thanks for suggesting it, Carol said to Sandra before guiding Barbara to a painting of a young couple who looked like they were in love. One of the mothers exclaimed,
Oh, wow, it's like a whole exhibit glorifying motherhood.
Natalie added, It's nice to get the appreciation we deserve, isn't it?
So rare in this day and age, Mary added. The Jews want us all slaving away in cubicles to make money for them instead of investing in the future of our people.
Carol said,
So true.
Sandra still wasn't convinced by all the Jew stuff, but hearing people praise women for something as uniquely feminine as motherhood made her a bit more sympathetic to their cause. As much pride as she felt for the cases she'd solved, there was a part of her that wondered if they were right about the importance of family. She didn't have a perfect relationship with her family, but she didn't have a bad relationship with them either, and seeing how happy and proud the moms seemed to be, and how much the loss of her fetus had affected Barbara was getting to her. Maybe she was just absorbing too much of the other girls' attitudes and feelings. She wondered how much that feeling would stick with her when the case was over.
Being in her 30s, she still had time to have kids if she decided to and found the right man, but she wasn't convinced she'd find the kind of husband who could give her the stay-at-home mom lifestyle that Natalie had gotten from Bruce and the money she'd earned from her writing, and she'd never heard the other two moms talk about having to go to work. Not that motherhood seemed any easier than having a job, but doing both at the same time sounded like a lot to her, and being a detective was a career that required commitment. "How much work is having kids, really?" Sandra asked, almost surprised at herself for having asked it. "A lot," one of the moms answered, "but it's much more fulfilling than the job I had before I had kids." "It's like being on call constantly," the other mom replied, "but you can still do a lot of the same stuff you would otherwise do. You just have to pause what you're doing to take care of them sometimes." Wendy commented, "Good thing I'm good at multitasking." "It gets a little easier as they get older," Natalie said, "or less time-consuming at least, and they're more fun when you can talk to them." "I can't wait for mine to learn to talk more," one of the moms said. "My oldest can be very funny when he wants to be. I hope he keeps that sense of humor as he grows up." The other mom encouraged her, "He's going to have all the ladies giggling if he does." Sandra asked, "It doesn't feel like they've completely consumed your life?" "I mean, sort of," one of them said. "It is nice to get a break from them every once in a while, but I wouldn't give it up for anything." "Right?" the other mom replied. "I feel so much more of a sense of purpose with them than I ever did before. I never really felt like I knew what I wanted or what I was doing with my life when I was younger. Now I know exactly what I'm doing with my life, and I love it." Sandra forced a smile. She felt like she had a pretty good idea of what she was doing with her life, so perhaps she wouldn't need kids to keep the feeling of purpose her job gave her, but she was happy that they seemed happy with their lives. As she caught herself thinking that, she wondered if she should. How hateful were they? How much did they sympathize with Secret Hitler? What even was Secret Hitler? She reminded herself of why she was there, but wasn't sure how to bring the conversation around to what she was investigating without seeming suspicious. "I sometimes wonder if it's right to bring kids into this world," Carol said. "I mean, with all the degeneracy, all the things Jews do to control us, all the immigrants and such who threaten us. I know we're supposed to, but it's hard for me to imagine making my kids grow up in a world like that." Even though the lines were spoken with all the right inflection, Sandra sensed a lack of real emotion behind them. "It's hard to shelter them from all the things Jews do to corrupt their innocent little minds," Natalie admitted. "That's part of why my last couple books were children's books, to give my kids something wholesome to grow up with. That's why we're homeschooling, too. It can be done, but it's not easy." "It would help if our men would drive out the invaders and overthrow the Jews," Wendy added with enthusiasm, "but I know it's an uphill battle for them, and some of our own people are our hardest opponents." "I know what you mean," Sandra replied, trying to fit in. "They do so many conspiratorial things to keep people under their control. It's hard to even keep track of it all, let alone keep yourself from falling for their staged events." She wondered if the other women had considered the possibility that Secret Hitler was controlled, or that groups like Patriot Front or Nova might be getting manipulated. Even though she didn't agree with their anti-Jewish conspiracy theories, this case was making her think much more conspiratorially. Someone was putting a lot of effort into pulling off the murders and spreading so much propaganda, and she needed to know who was behind it for her own safety as well as for the sake of solving the case. "Thankfully we have the internet," Mary said with a slight laugh. "What would we do without it?" Carol asked with a smile. Barbara hadn't said much in a while, and Sandra understood why, but still felt she and Carol were behaving oddly. After a little while, the group moved on to another room. This one was full of paintings of buildings and urban skylines. Sandra found some of the architecture interesting, particularly one asymmetrical office building where one side rose up higher than the other. Most of the buildings looked modern, but there were some that looked like they may have been from as far back as the Renaissance. "All these paintings of buildings and not a single Hitler," Wendy said with a little tut-tut sound. Sandra was a bit confused, but Mary, Natalie, and the two moms giggled. Carol let out a little laugh after a moment, but Barbara looked confused too. Then it dawned on Sandra. "Oh, right, he was a painter too. You know, I've never actually seen any of his paintings." The fact that Barbara had been as confused as her, and Carol simply seemed to have followed the crowd, made her even more curious about them. Maybe they were just new to this whole Nazi thing, and hadn't spent as much time thinking about Hitler as the rest of the group. "Really? He was quite talented," Mary said as she pulled out her phone. Moments later she was showing Sandra and the rest of the group Hitler's art.
There were paintings of castles, churches, old-timey city skylines, woodland animals in a forest, a young couple looking into each other's eyes with smiles on their faces, and Mary with her baby Jesus. Sandra thought she remembered Hitler having a bunch of problems with the church, but she guessed that was long after his career as a painter had ended and given way to his political ambitions. Many of his paintings were impressive, just as good as many of the paintings lining the walls, despite how horrible the man who painted them seemed to her. Barbara said, "Wow, I didn't know he was that good." Sandra added, "Yeah, makes you wonder why he didn't get accepted to art school." "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Mary responded with a smile. Mary put her phone away and they returned their attention to the buildings lining the walls. Carol asked, "Hey Barbara, doesn't this one look just like that big office building near your place?" Barbara went and looked it over. "I think that is the one by my place, yeah." There was a little placard under the painting and she bent down to look at it. "It is! Painted a few years ago by a local artist." The group gathered around to look at it. Sandra recognized it, and most of the rest of the group did too, but she noticed a worried look growing on Wendy's face. Wendy asked, "Barbara, that daycare you mentioned earlier, it wasn't Carefree Playpen, was it?" That sounds right. Why?" "Oh, no." Wendy's face twisted up into a pained expression. "Don't ever send your kids there. Don't ever let anyone you know send their kids there. That's one of the ones that Jew Suzanne Vogel runs. One of the people from my church made the mistake of sending their kids there, and you do not want to hear the horror stories they had to tell about it, or the bullshit excuses the police gave for not shutting it down." "Oh, I've heard of that one," one of the moms added with a horrified look on her face. "One of my old neighbors sent her kids there. One of them went missing a couple years ago. They claimed she just ran away, but afterwards the family bought a new sports car that they couldn't afford. There were rumors that the same thing happened before. Kids who went missing there were reported missing, but the parents wouldn't dare accuse the daycare, and magically ended up with a big bonus from work or won 20 grand in the lottery or something crazy at the same time." "Oh, that sounds sketchy," the other mom said. "This is why I don't send my kids to daycare." Sandra thought back to a missing persons case she'd worked a couple years ago. The parents had reported their kid missing and claimed she ran away in the middle of the night, but they wouldn't share the ring cam footage. When she came back with a warrant, they changed their story and said their kid ran away in the afternoon after they'd picked the kid up from daycare and stopped at the park on the way home. Sandra had tried to get footage from security cameras near the park, but neither the kid nor parent was in any of the footage, and she couldn't find any witnesses to corroborate the parent's story. She had asked the daycare for their security camera footage, but was told they didn't have cameras, which she was pretty sure was a lie. She wanted to look into it further, but her boss had pushed her to move on to other cases, and unlike most missing person cases involving a child, the parents didn't seem that interested in finding their kid. She was pretty sure the daycare was Carefree Playpen, but she would have to look back at her old case notes to check. "You there, Sandra?" Mary asked. "You looked like you got lost for a second there." "Oh, just the stories about the daycare. Made me think back to a missing friend's kid from a couple years ago. Makes me wonder if it was the same daycare." Sandra was pretty sure her minor lie was convincing, as it was almost the truth. "Ugh, why doesn't Secret Hitler call them out?" Carol asked. "Seems like the kind of thing they should be doing." "Maybe it's the kind of thing we should be doing," Wendy replied. "Why wait for Secret Hitler when we could do something about it ourselves?" "That's a great idea," Natalie replied. "Do you have a sticker printer? We could put up stickers calling out Suzanne Vogel and warning people away from Carefree Playpen." "No," Wendy replied. "Nova sends me packs of stickers in the mail when I ask for them." Natalie seemed disappointed. "Oh, darn." "Don't office supply stores sell sticker sheets you can put through a printer?" Sandra asked, having used them before at work. Wendy explained, "Yeah, but those ones aren't waterproof, so as soon as it rains, the ink washes out." "Oh, dang," Sandra replied. "Guess we'll have to wait for Secret Hitler then." "We can still go out and put up Nova stickers," Wendy suggested. "They just won't be about the daycare." Carol said, "Tell me more about Nova." "Yeah, sure," Wendy said enthusiastically. "Nova is a pro-white advocacy group trying to raise awareness of all the issues affecting our people and encourage whites to be proud of our race and support our own kind the way every other race is encouraged to do, which mostly comes down to putting up stickers," she said with a laugh.
But we do other stuff too, like every year we do a Christmas fundraiser where we help white families in need get food, clothes, and toys for Christmas, and other charity and community assistance like that. Carol asked, "Do you guys put up stickers often?" Wendy replied, "We do it about once a month here, and there are people across the country doing it too." "Weird how I've never heard of them before," Carol said, "but Secret Hitler is all over the news every time they do something." Mary suggested, "Probably because of the murders." "That or it's a psyop," Wendy suggested. "Like whenever that Christ-hater Handsome Truth would do rallies, the media would cover him and then try to use the news about him to push hate speech laws." "Ugh, I used to like him," Mary said. "His streams were funny. It's one of the reasons I got into this in the first place. Now he just shits on Jesus all day and divides people. I don't think he's a psyop, though." "Ye will know them by their fruits," one of the moms said. "If they're passing laws taking away our rights because of him, then he's probably being promoted for a reason." "He could be real," the other mom said. "They might have cracked down because he was getting through to people and it scared them. I hate thinking everything is fake." Wendy shook her head. "He used to work in Hollywood and had a Jew hosting his website when it started. Once people started figuring him out, he stopped trying to rally people to our cause and started pushing that divisive paganism crap." "Just because he's pagan doesn't mean he's a bad guy," Mary said. "Some people are misled by the lies Jews tell about the Bible, so they look for an alternative because they haven't found the truth yet. I try to have sympathy for the people who've been misled by Satan." "Are there really that many Jews pretending to be Nazis?" Carol asked with a curious look on her face. Wendy replied, "Too many." "It's what they do," Sandra replied, hoping she could repeat their talking points convincingly. "They try to control their own opposition. There's a quote from one of the communist Jews, Lenin or Trotsky, I think, about how the best way to deal with the opposition is to control it yourself. That's how they operate." She didn't think that sort of behavior was really limited to Jews, but it did make sense from a strategic standpoint, and it was something she'd have to keep in mind as she looked for clues about who was behind Secret Hitler. Wendy said, "Exactly, that's so real." Mary added, "That's why it's so important to separate the real resistance from the fake, controlled resistance." Barbara asked, "Do you think Secret Hitler is real or fake resistance?" "I don't know for sure, but probably fake," Wendy replied. "They get too much attention to be real." "I don't know. They could still be real," Mary said, "but you do have a point." "It's easy to assume everything is Feds or Jews," Natalie said. "People said the same thing about Patriot Front, but they seem like good guys. People say Mike Enoch and his crew work for Jews because his ex-wife was a Jew or something, but look at all the good work they do. I don't know about the Proud Boys, but Mike seems to trust the local guys. So maybe sometimes you just have to trust that most of the people who join these groups are well-meaning and hope you can spot the infiltrators." "That's actually why I'm a little wary of Nova," Mary replied, "and there are probably a few Feds who've joined Patriot Front, even though most of them are good people. I think that's how it is with any group like that. Most of the people who join want to do what they think is right, but some jerks who want to control everything send their little agents in on their puppet strings to do their bidding and manipulate the group, and either get them to do something dumb or start stupid fights and break up their group." "That political stuff gets too complicated for me," one of the moms said. "That's why I'd rather just focus on raising my kids right and let someone else figure it out." The other mom agreed. "That's all we really can do." "I just hope they're not setting up the next big psyop," Wendy said. "You know, like George Floyd or COVID or whatever. Use it to usher in the police state they want." Barbara asked, "Wouldn't a police state be fascism, though?" "Not if it's run by Jews who want to throw white people in jail for standing up for ourselves," Wendy replied. "The Jews always played both sides of things. One minute they're getting people hyped up to defund the police, the next they're getting us hyped up for a police state. If we defund the police, the Jewish mafia gets to take everything over and get away with all their crimes. If we get a police state, they use it to crack down on hate speech and arrest people for criticizing the Jews. Either way, they win, and they try to rig the game that way from the start." "I couldn't write a villain as evil as the Jews if I tried," Natalie said in a tone that was as amused as it was disgusted. "And believe me, I'm trying." "If I didn't know they were demonic, I wouldn't be able to believe they could be real," Mary said. All this talk about them is bringing me down. I need to drown my sorrows in either wine or ice cream." One of the moms said, "Ice cream sounds good." Natalie agreed. "I could definitely go for ice cream." "I was going to go for wine," Barbara said, "but ice cream is almost as good." "I'm a little worried you might drown your sorrows in too much wine," Mary said. "Let's go with ice cream." "Ice cream it is," Wendy said with a smile. "We've still got a little bit of museum left," Sandra said, "but ice cream after sounds wonderful." She had to admit she was a bit more impressed with some of the girls than she'd expected to be. It seems they'd already started asking the kinds of questions about Secret Hitler that she needed to look into. Maybe they weren't the real threat after all, but if that was the case, she was wasting her time investigating them, and might as well enjoy herself for the rest of the evening.